Welcome to the Citizens Band Radio Hour. Thoughtful conversations that explore issues of media and journalism, democracy and citizenship. The Citizens Band Radio Hour is sponsored by the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. You can visit the center online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Here's your host, Coy Barefoot.
Robert McChesney is a best-selling and award-winning author, a celebrated media activist, and a professor of communications at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. His many books include The Future of Media, The Death and Life of American Journalism, Dollarocracy, and most recently, Blowing the Roof Off the 21st Century. You can find Bob online at robertmcchesney.org. This conversation was originally recorded in May of 2015. Bob, it is such a personal privilege to have you on this program, sir. I cannot thank you enough for being with us.
It's my pleasure to be here, Coy.
Let me begin by asking a very broad strokes question here. We are all busy. We all have very little time. We've got a lot of things we need to be thinking about and to worry about and to focus on. What is it about the media? What is it about the internet, television, radio, newspapers? Why should we devote our time to talking about this, to be concerned about this? What is it in particular that you can point at, you can say, that's why this is important?
Well, I think all democratic theory, including the theory that guided the people who framed our Constitution, is predicated on the idea that for people who are not wealthy and powerful to actually participate in governance, it requires that they know what they're doing, and that requires a credible press system or media system. That's always been true. It's still true today. And if you don't have that, your political democracy suffers and becomes a non-democracy on one hand, and your economy invariably becomes much more dominated by powerful monopolistic forces. So it's sort of at the center of everything. I mean, it really is, it's impossible to conceive of a credible, free democratic society without a solid media system. I mean, I just defy someone to come up with one. It just simply can't be done in contemporary times. And that means it affects every aspect of our lives, including our personal lives. There's no way around that fact.
And of course, here we are in Charlottesville. The University of Virginia is a few miles from where I sit now, as is Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson. And there was perhaps no stronger voice among that generation, the founding generation, no stronger voice to remind us repeatedly why what he called the press, what we might call journalism or media, why that was such an integral part of this formula to both to create but also to maintain and to nourish human liberty.
You're absolutely right. And in fact, James Madison, who was from nearby to where you are now, and Jefferson, both sort of almost competed to see who could be the most concerned about press in the early America. They were both wrote at length about it. It was a central issue to both of them. And what's striking, because I've studied their work at some detail, what's striking is there were two issues that they were both really quite concerned with. One was they thought that it was imperative to have a credible press system so that people without property could participate in the political system. And that, I mean, Jefferson was just blunt about it. That was, he said, unless we have a credible free press system that serves people who are not wealthy, we will invariably become a country like Europe, where, as he put it, the wolves eat the sheep. And the wolves, he said, for those who are metaphorically challenged, mean the rich. He said the rich will dominate the poor without a free press. And both Jefferson and Madison wrote at length about how imperative it was to have a free press system to monitor the militarism of the national government. And Jefferson and Adams, their words here are almost prescient because they so closely describe the United States today. They understood the United States was, on the edge of this very rich continent, and the country was soon to be, within a generation or two, a great power. They knew that was in the country's future, and they both feared that. I mean, they understood it, they embraced it, but they also understood that even in a democracy, people who run governments have spectacular temptation to become militaristic powers, to flex their muscles overseas. And this frightened both Jefferson and Madison almost beyond words. It frightened President Washington, who in his first farewell address spent great length warning future Americans not to let militarism become too important a part of our lives. And they saw the press was the only way that you could monitor governments in power, no matter how much they might be popular, to prevent them from going off and starting crazy wars and building empires around the world and militarizing society. And militarizing society, in their view, was almost certainly the death knell of the republic, because with militarism, as they both put it, comes inequality, corruption, secrecy, what they call propaganda to sort of whip people into nationalistic hysteria, all the sort of things that made their skin crawl. And
their worst fears have been realized, would you say?
Oh, yeah. It's absolutely astonishing to read their words and to look at America today, where we have really $1 trillion a year military national security apparatus, which is almost entirely outside the review of the American people. The news media barely covers it, and what does pass for coverage is mostly cheerleading. And then our Congress barely reviews it. One of the funny lines or tragic lines of the last decade was in a book where a person high up at the Pentagon said, when we go to Congress now, we have to battle to get our budget reduced. I mean, they're so gung-ho about giving us money and starting wars. I mean, we're the ones who are the deficit hawks for military spending. We're the ones who get the money.
So, Bob, we have been told that if we want to maintain a healthy press, as we are talking about, a crucial ingredient in preserving democracy and the tools that we have developed as a free people to preserve our liberty, we have to deregulate the media. We have to let business do what business does. And you have written quite a bit about this, the very idea of deregulated media. How should we understand that?
Well, deregulation is a great word. It's very popular. No one wants to be regulated. I mean, so I said, do you want to be regulated or deregulated? You'd say, I'd rather be deregulated. I want to lead my own life. And so it plays on a natural sympathy that any person has for deregulation is a very good idea, as a notion of freedom. But the whole concept of deregulation, when it applies to communication and media, is nonsensical. It doesn't apply. It's purely a propagandistic term. When cable companies and satellite companies and internet service providers and broadcasters talk about deregulation, they don't mean, hey, we're going to give up our monopoly licenses and the great privileges we have. We'll throw it open to everyone to have an equal shot at our market. What they mean is they want to be able to have even more monopoly power. They want to be able to have a cable company that doesn't just cover 20% of the country, but covers 40 or 50% of it. That to them is deregulation. There's no rules, no conditions put on the monopoly licenses the government grants these companies that are so lucrative to them. It's purely a scam, and I think most Americans actually get it. I think that in the 90s, when the internet came along and sort of in the gust of hot air that accompanied that era, the idea of deregulation seemed to have some popular momentum behind it. It's certainly fueled by corporate money. Today, I think people see it for what it is. We deregulated the banks, we deregulated telecommunication, we deregulated the phone companies, and all that happens is we're getting hosed.
I think it is important that we understand, and you have written about this many times, that democracy is a political system, capitalism is an economic system, but what we are witnessing in our own time is that political system is itself becoming a capitalistic economic system. And I think it's generous to call it capitalism. It's oligopoly, it's plutocracy, which are very different economic systems. Can you explain this process to us, what we are witnessing, what is the challenge, and how should we make sense of it?
Coy, the capitalism and democracy, or a profit-driven economic system where the whole idea is to make as much money as possible endlessly with no end in sight, because there's never too much. And that type of economic system, generally called capitalism. And democracy, the idea of the rule of the poor, as Aristotle called it, where people are equal politically, so therefore those without property tend to run the government. They've always been in an antagonistic relationship. I think Americans today are told they're basically two sides of the same coin. But if we look historically at American history or the history of almost any other country, what we find is the forces who most benefited by dominating the private economy rarely were big proponents of extending the franchise and promoting democracy. They were mostly big proponents of protecting their huge amounts of property from any sort of political challenge. And the great moves for democracy in American history have been led generally by poor people and propertyless people. The great waves of expansion of the franchise, the emergence of the great social programs that raised the standard of living for the bulk of the population, gave us things like public education, labor unions, Social Security, the weekends for workers, these sort of things. And, so it's always been an antagonistic relationship. What's happened in the United States is that we went through a long period from around 1900 to 1970 in which there were tremendous democratic advances in America. Now, they didn't just happen in a linear form. They went in fits and starts. There were great struggles back and forth. But 1970 America was a dramatically different country than 1900 America. It was far more egalitarian. The standard of living for poor people or working class people was significantly higher. The gap between rich and poor was significantly smaller. Mobility, economic mobility from one class to another for a young person was much greater. It was really a very different country. And it was veering very close to social democracy in the sort of the European sense compared to our history. So this was, this is a part of our great history. Since the early 1970s, there's been a concerted effort by business interests, corporate interests, to sort of scale back democracy. They thought that by the end of the 1960s, democracy gotten out of hand. They put an extremism of democracy. There was too much democracy, and they wanted government to be returned to the hands of big business and corporations as traditional rulers. And what we've seen for the last 40 years is that counter-revolution of sorts has taken place. Governance today in the United States is dominated by business interests, both parties, especially at the commanding heights, not talking about the backbenchers. And the political debate has shifted way to the right. So a lot of the issues that are now considered fair game for debate, like getting rid of public education, getting rid of Social Security or privatizing it, these are things that would have been similar to advocating pedophilia 40 or 50 years ago. They would have been political suicide. They were unthinkable, even to people, who were at the extreme right wing of the political spectrum. So we've had this tremendous change. And, what we've seen, and I think, we see it all around us, is that people have really lost a lot of their enthusiasm for our political system. We have arguably, if not emphatically, the lowest voter turnout rate of any major democracy in the world, maybe even minor democracy. In the 2014 off-year elections, just around 1/3 of American adults voted for Congress. That gave us this new Congress. And what we see now too is that the corruption of our governing system is palpable. It's really striking, and I'll end on this note, but it's worth saying that in the last 4 years or so, 3 separate teams of political scientists, great political scientists from some of our best universities in the country, have all reached pretty much the same conclusion after studying how the U.S. federal and state governments work. And they've reached the conclusion that, in effect, the opinions, values, and concerns of the bottom 90 to 95% of the population have absolutely no influence whatsoever on their elected representatives. The government basically operates on behalf of the wealthy. Those are the only relevant lobbies that really matter to the people who make the decisions in this country. And of course, if you understand that, if people feel that, then obviously why vote? That's why we have such a horrendously low voter turnout. But it also speaks to the fact that we're not really a democracy. Democracy is supposed to mean that people run the country. And what the evidence tells us now is people have absolutely no influence. It's run by private interests, wealthy interests, and they're sort of politicians who are their puppets in Washington and state capitals.
I'm reminded of Chris Hedges' works. Chris has been a guest on this program many times, and Chris is not shy about saying that we need some type of revolution. Exactly what that would look like is anybody's guess. From where you sit, though, Bob, what is the solution to these problems?
Well, I think the solution actually isn't that complicated. If you look at all the things that have made us less democratic, those are probably the things we need to rejuvenate. I think, the tension between the capitalist system, and again, it's just the really existing capitalism, not the one of folklore or economics textbook, but the real world of rich people trying to get richer, and buying politicians is a very rational way to get richer, and much of the system being dependent upon close relations with the government. This system has got to be changed, and we need to have make democracy actually viable again. And for that to happen, we're going to have to change our economy significantly. How we change it, that's something that's got to be debated, discussed, studied. But clearly, the type of economy we have right now isn't working well, and it's ruining our government. So it's unavoidable. You want to call it a revolution? That's a term that's not a term I use, but it has that effect, I guess, in the long run. If something happens, I think it can be done through our system, actually. But, the point is that our economic system's got to be dramatically overhauled. It's just simply not effective any longer for the great bulk of the people, and it's destroying democracy.
Bob, you mentioned the income gap. For those who are listening who have yet to really wrap their minds around that, the realities of the income gap in America today, why is that important? Why is that, for those who just don't see why people like you make a big deal about this, why is it a big deal?
Well, it is a big deal because, in theory, and this is academic lingo, but in theory, having an effective functioning democracy can't really work if you have tremendous economic inequality. And this isn't complicated. This was something the framers of our country understood well. In fact, for that reason, Ben Franklin was a proponent of sort of having limits on how much wealth and income a person could have. He thought they should not be allowed to have so much that they can overwhelm other people. And both Madison and Jefferson were strong proponents of having the government basically transfer resources from the rich to the poor, so there'd be more equality in society to make the governing system work best. They understood it was imperative. So we all know that, and all political scientists know that you can't have the sort of extreme economic inequality we traditionally found in third world countries and expect to have anything remotely close to an effective, free, self-governing democratic society. But it's really, and that's a given. So that's abstract, though, it's theoretical. I would put it this way. The difference is that growing up as I did in the 1960s in Cleveland, Ohio, in a much more egalitarian time, and certainly it was a time that had great problems, but there was a general sense that working class people could really advance and had a chance in that society to be full participants. And I think we've lost that now. Now when I go around America and see the gated communities and the tens of millions of people sort of out of view, it's much more like what you hear about in Brazil or India, where the relevant society is a small percentage of the society. It's not the whole society. It's the top 20, 30, 40% at most, and the real players are even smaller than that. And we've become a society that sort of confirms Tom Paine's worst nightmare. Tom Paine, the great pamphleteer and journalist whose words more than anyone else has inspired the American Revolution. He wrote when he went to France before the Revolution, he was just appalled by the inequality in France. And he said it was so grotesque, it was like seeing living people walk around with dead people chained to their feet. And I think that's the society we're becoming. Now, if you're really rich and you live in a gated community and you don't have to climb over homeless people, don't worry about them, you say, hey, that's their problem, it's the free market. I guess that's no problem. But I think for most of us, that is a problem. And I think the research shows that even for people that are doing well off, they're much happier in a society that's more egalitarian, where everyone's got a shot, where people are sort of in it together. It's not just everyone for themselves. The research, in fact, is pretty emphatic in that regard.
Bob, how do you explain the internet today to somebody, and specifically the internet, where the use of the internet intersects with citizenship, with democracy, with the theme that is running through this conversation, that liberty is precious and liberty won't save itself, and that human liberty is a very real thing. We now have your students, my students, the first generation in human history to be born and to live their entire lives with an internet. They did not see it come online. They don't know dial-up. They have 3 or 4 screens at one time. They live in a different world than you and I grew up in. How should we understand the internet's place in this conversation we're having?
Well, I think the way you asked the question, Coy, really gets at the fact that we're talking about something that has fundamentally transformed the way people lead their lives. It is, it's turned everything upside down and inside out. And as someone who teaches young people, you see it every day. Anyone who has children sees it, especially if you're older like I am. And young people today can barely understand how people can even communicate before they had smartphones and tablet computers. I mean, their lives are just seamlessly integrated with the digital revolution. And so at that level, there's no other way to put it. It is a defining technological revolution that comes along, once every few centuries. It's of that nature. Now, as for the issues of democracy and capitalism, it opens up a lot of very interesting questions that I've tried to deal with in my research. Back when it first emerged as a ubiquitous medium and exploded with the creation of the World Wide Web in the early 1990s, the claims for the internet were very powerful. On one hand, it was going to be a tremendous force for democracy because it would give everyone the power to have access to all the information of the world, and even the poorest person would be able to participate effectively as a citizen, and it would expose liars and chicanery and authoritarian governments were all going to be on the endangered species list. That was the political benefit of the internet. It was simply a godsend for the democratic values of the world for human freedom. The economic claims for the internet were similar. The internet was going to be an engine of competition. It was going to blast open stodgy old oligopolistic markets and create space for young, plucky entrepreneurs to come in to better serve consumers with lower prices. And if they didn't do the job, competition would do it, just run them out of the market and do it otherwise. Prices would come down, the system would become more efficient, it would help the environment. It was a win-win-win-win-win situation in the 1990s to hear the people talking about the internet. And, it sounded good. I wish it had been true. But it hasn't been true. And I think in the case of the economy in particular, the idea that the internet was going to blast open competitive capitalism and entrepreneurialism and lead to a golden age of capitalism and huge amounts of growth and creative entrepreneurship, all the sort of buzzwords we've been marinated in for the last 20 years, it's just a farce. I mean, what the internet has become is the greatest engine of economic monopoly in the history of the human race. It is, the internet is dominated now by a small handful of absolutely spectacularly huge companies, all of which are, by traditional economic criteria, monopolies. They have market share comparable to what John D. Rockefeller had with Standard Oil in the late 19th century, which was the greatest monopoly in the history of capitalism. Even at his peak, John D. Rockefeller only had about 80-85% of the market. He had as much as he needed to control the market and the most profitable level for him to work at. And so the internet is far from being a source of competition, is a source of spectacular monopoly. This poses all sorts of problems for us. Politically, for starters, it means that, the 30 most valuable companies in the American economy today, we're out 12 or 13, depending on what they haven't checked for a week or two. 12 or 13 are internet monopolies. That means they have spectacular political power that goes with that sort of economic power, which means they more or less run the board in Washington. The U.S. government becomes their private army representing their interests at home and abroad. And that's, there's no history where that's ever been a good thing for a free society. I'm still looking for that society where that sort of monopolistic power and cahoots with big government is something we should embrace. Quite the contrary. So we have the internet. The economic promise has been destroyed. There's no middle class of internet firms. It's basically the big guys. Everyone knows their names by now. Google, Apple, Amazon, eBay, Facebook, right on down the list, Microsoft. And so the economic promise has been not really advanced. And then we've had the tragic turn since the 90s where one of the key ways profits are generated on the Internet is by ubiquitous, incessant surveillance, commercial and government, but especially commercial surveillance of everything we do online. It's a way to monetize the Internet, so to speak. So we pay a heavy price in our freedoms in order for this thing to work commercially. And the whole economy now that's dominated by these Internet firms is mired in the worst amount of stagnation that capitalism has faced since the 1930s. So all in all, I'd say right now, the Internet hasn't really hit the ball over the fence when it comes to the economy, quite the contrary. And we've already talked about where democracy's at. So far, we haven't seen any considerable evidence the Internet's turning that around either.
You mentioned the corporate surveillance. Would you agree that that's perhaps one of the that larger story has been flying under the radar? We know about the NSA and PRISM and Edward Snowden and the government surveillance and the repeated daily violations of the Fourth Amendment. Guys who get up and men and women who go to work for the government and they're criminals. They're violating the Constitution. But they were trying to get in on a business that corporate America was already in on, and that was surveillance. And that corporate surveillance goes hand in hand with the government surveillance.
Yeah, they work together. I mean, this is a very complementary relationship between the largest Internet monopolies and the federal government, the National Security Agency. Glenn Greenwald's done wonderful work exposing this repeatedly for the last 5 or 10 years in his writings. This is a very comfortable relationship. There's a lot of benefits for both sides. But yeah, commercial surveillance is just the other side of the coin from NSA surveillance. They both go hand in hand. They work together, and it is a frightening prospect. You know, the classical definition of fascism is when powerful private interests work closely with the government to advance the private interests of these commercial interests of the corporations, of the monopolies, and the government concentrates on surveillance, propaganda to whip the population into hysteria, and militarism. It doesn't do anything else really. This is a sort of situation. I'm not saying we're a fascist society, but I think an honest look at the way the English language is used would say we have a political economy, a political economic structure now, which is too close to it. I think that anyone should be comfortable with the situation we're in now.
We're talking with media scholar Bob McChesney. His most recent book is Blowing the Roof Off the 21st Century Media. Bob, what about Edward Snowden? How should we interpret his legacy? And I know historians many years from now will try to do that, but there are those who hate him. He's a traitor. He betrayed our government. They're the same people that will decry the power of government. But how do you make sense of Edward Snowden's actions?
Well, the idea that Edward Snowden is a traitor, that's really an interesting twist on the notion of patriotism. One I have trouble wrapping my head around. He clearly, he's the Patrick Henry or whatever of this generation. He's exposed extraordinary amount of illegal activity, completely unnecessary for the national security of this country, that deprive people of their freedoms and liberties and that undermined the constitutional rule of this country. He's clearly a hero. He took great personal sacrifice to do this, and he's not getting rich from it. And if he did, I have no problem with that, because what he did was really valuable and really helpful. And he went a long way towards trying to change the debate, although elites in this country are so hard to move. They're so intractable that I don't know how much we've changed the debate. I think we've just changed the nature of the public relations the people in power spew out, more than we've actually changed anything beneath it. But, he's a hero, and we should embrace him. It took a lot of courage to do what he did in an environment where he wasn't getting a whole lot of support, and he's willing to sacrifice his life is what he believed in. And to my knowledge, what he revealed was the emperor's wearing no clothes. And all these claims that this massive illegal surveillance was necessary to thwart alleged presumed terrorist attacks was just a hill of beans. It just didn't really add up. And so, and when the people who looked at the data closely have a hard time finding exactly what he exposed that genuinely threatened our national security. What it did do is it threatened a completely unaccountable national security apparatus that didn't want anyone to be monitoring it. And I understand that. That's a bureaucratic impulse, and that was going strong.
There's that really riveting moment in Citizen 4 where he says, I was sitting there watching this engine be created that has never existed in human history, that was the greatest tool for oppression and fascism that has ever existed in the human story. And what was I going to do? I just couldn't sit there and take it and watch them build this machine. That machine being built now, Bob, the synergy of the corporate surveillance with government surveillance, are we seeing a new, almost a new branch of government that is being built right before our eyes?
Well, I would only say that this is a process that's been going on for 70 years. I mean, we came out of, the United States, this is something most Americans don't realize, until about 1940, the United States was a country which really paid, except for when it mowed down and slaughtered Native Americans across the continent to take their land, with that notable and crucial exception, the United States as a country was not a military power in an international sense. We occasionally built up huge armies like in World War I or in the Civil War, but as soon as the war was over, we demobilized. And, we went back to having a very small standing army, which is exactly what we're supposed to have. Even in the 1930s, we had a smaller army than Germany had as a result of the Versailles Treaty. Germany was handcuffed. They had to have a small army because they lost World War I of the very onerous restrictions in the Versailles Treaty, and we had a smaller one than Germany. So that tells you just how unmilitarized we were. We were not a militaristic nation whatsoever. And then it was in the 1940s, coming out of the Second World War, that the United States became a permanent warfare economy. And we've been it pretty much for the last 70 years. So this is really grows out of an apparatus that developed in the 40s and 50s for a variety of reasons. The one thing we know, the reason it didn't develop because of the Soviet Union. Specifically, or the threat of communist empire, because if that were the case, we would have dismantled it in 1990, like we dismantled our military machine in 1917 or 1918 and in 1865. No, it's taken on a huge institutional life of its own. It doesn't really need justification to politicians, to the public, to have this huge military machine. And this was long before the Internet came along. The Internet just sort of naturally has been taken over by it and used by it and subsumed by it, but it's not responsible for the militarization of our life or what's going on with national security. It's just empowered it that much more.
And as James Madison wrote so eloquently, those tools for defending us abroad will eventually be brought home, and now we see that militarism in our law enforcement, and we're seeing it in our schools as well.
Yes, indeed. I mean, again, when you read Madison, and Jefferson too, but especially Madison on this specific issue, it's hard not to think that we have become the exact opposite of what they wrote about so brilliantly in the first decades of this country's history.
With the election for president coming up in 2016, Bob, from where you sit, what are some of the tools you will be sharing with your students that you could share with us that we perhaps should be keeping in mind as we watch the onslaught, the hundreds of millions of dollars spent on propaganda to make people think a certain way about these people?
Well, your question really gets at one of the great problems we have. We have no journalism left in America to speak of, very little. No political journalism of hardly any value. In fact, most of what passes for political journalism in the United States would fit comfortably in, the Beijing talking about debates in the Central Committee. It's just mostly gossip, inanity. It's funny in our news media coverage of politics now, like they were going after Jeb Bush for what he said about the Iraq War. And it wasn't his actual position in the Iraq War. The media was getting after him because he didn't have a line of BS that he could snow people with. It was like the fact that he might have had the wrong position, or they changed his position, or that it's an issue that you ought to have a position on, was really beside the point. Our news media is more interested in sort of the inside baseball, judging politicians by how well they can lie and get away with it. So Hillary Clinton, same thing. She's going to be what she actually would do about the Trans-Pacific Partnership as she were President Clinton is less important to our news media and our political journalism, whether she can snow her voting base into not caring about it, because she'll do whatever she wants when she's elected. And it's sort of this cynicism that's in our journalism, that's basically given up on the idea that people can actually influence government to work for them. That breeds the place where these ads play such a large outside role because there's nothing else to get information on. You almost require ads to know who's even running. There's so little journalism, and the ads are almost all sewage. They're deeply offensive. And again, this contributes to the fact that you have to be therefore very rich to run or serve people who are very rich on one hand, and on the other hand, it contributes to the fact that so few Americans know compared to other countries, and it's sharply declining. And it's really a tragedy. And the reason I'd say it's a tragedy is that, I travel this country a lot. I give lots of talks every year. I get to, I have a lot of contact with Americans across the political spectrum, all over the country. And this is not a crazy goofball right-wing country. This is a very progressive country. People are really open to having a serious discussion, and they're deeply frustrated by a political system where they have no role to play. And it's a great tension in our society today. This is a much more progressive country today than it was, say, 30 years ago. And there's not even a comparison. And we have great issues that need to be settled. They're not being addressed by our political system. Our political system is almost irrelevant. It's just part of the problem. And as someone who's a political junkie, as someone who grew up, memorizing, who all the governors and members of Congress when I was a kid, this is something that's heartbreaking for me. And it's simply not a situation that's tenable. It's got to change.
The tools that our founders came up with to preserve liberty, democracy among them, are wedded with these concepts of citizenship and nation state. But we seem to be entering a point in the human story where they're threatened to become anachronisms. The idea of citizenship, the idea of a nation state in this global era. Is the very idea of citizenship and of a democracy and of the nation state now eroding?
Well, it's eroding because the system's eroding. It's not eroding because the people of this country say, hey, I don't want to be a citizen. I don't want to have any power. I don't want to let the Koch brothers and the banks decide my life for me. I don't hear a lot of people talking like that. So I don't think it's like we're in some tectonic moment where the notion of being a citizen, of having an effective democratic society, is losing its validity for most people. I think what it's losing is its existence, and people are frustrated. And I think it does cause sort of cognitive dissonance when the system we have in this country is called democracy, yet it does nothing that democracy should do, so people are deeply confused by it. I think we're definitely there. As for the nation state, I think, we're moving ultimately towards a period probably, if humanity is going to survive our current travails and go to a higher stage, ultimately the notion of nation states as we've understood it for the last 200 years is going to have to be changed, especially the military aspect of nation states. But at the same time, I think the nation state's still the dominant player in our minds for quite some time. They're still the ones who have most of the guns until they privatize all the armed forces. And I don't think we're post-nation state anywhere near there, and won't be for quite some time.
He is a professor, author, activist, journalist. Bob McChesney is at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and his most recent book is Blowing the Roof Off the 21st Century Media, Politics, and the Struggle for Post-Capitalist Democracy. Bob, it's been a real personal privilege, and I hope we can do this again sometime. I can't thank you enough for your time.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. I'd like to do it again, and good night, everyone in Charlottesville.
You've been listening to the Citizens Band Radio Hour, a production of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Archived podcasts are available online at mediaandcitizenship.org. The executive producers for the program are Siva Vaidyanathan and Koi Barefoot.